Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is former Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. Secretary Ross, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me on again.
We have another iteration of our tariff conversation. The Supreme Court has entered the chat and has announced that it will weigh on the legality of President Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. And this comes after the tariffs faced another legal setback, this time in an appeals court, where the court ruled that President Trump overstepped his authority by invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is known as IEEPA, to impose them. So to start off the conversation, what do you make of the nation's highest court deciding on the fate of the tariffs?
Well, I think it's a very, very important issue, and I think they recognize that it is an important issue. IEEPA, which is the acronym for the act that President Trump is using, has really never been tested in this context. So using it for tariffs is a quite novel thing. And I think that's a reason why they would find it useful to do. Also, the request that they review it was joined in both by Trump and by the litigants. They want it ruled by the Supreme Court as well. And it seems to me that makes it even more difficult for them not to hear it. So I think they made a very useful and very sound decision to hear it. Now the question is, where do they come out on it? And that, of course, we don't know yet. In the last administration, we did not use IEEPA. We used Section 232, Section 301, a number of provisions that clearly do have an import for tariffs. The question about the IEEPA is, was it meant to be used for tariffs? So that's one threshold question. Then the second threshold question would be, and is this an appropriate use of it? And I think for the most part, if you get over the first question, for the most part, I think they would tend to uphold it. A few of the provisions, for example, saying that the treatment of Bolsonaro by the courts in Brazil constitutes an emergency for the U.S. I think that's a little hard. It's harder to make that connection. But I think you can very well say that the trade deficit, the implications that it has for the economy have reached the point where it's a really big danger. And some of the tariffs that he's put in, for example, on steel and aluminum, we had authorized under prior legislation during the first administration. So those should be very safe. So I guess what I'm saying is I would be surprised if the court just turned out the whole thing, but they may very well say, but this particular provision went too far.
How many tariffs do you think that would impact then? Because former Republican Senator John Danforth, he served in the Senate Finance Committee. He also chaired the International Trade Subcommittee, had a conversation with me about the tariffs earlier this week. He signed onto an amicus brief in the case against the tariffs. And he essentially told me that this is a pretty cut and dry case, right? It has nothing to do if tariffs are a good idea or a bad idea, but instead if they are constitutional or not. And in the Constitution, it says that the power to tax belongs to Congress, not to the president. So what do you think of that argument?
Well, we have the precedent that we already imposed tariffs in the first administration that did not go to the Congress, and they were upheld by the Supreme Court. So I didn't hear his actual remarks, so I don't know the context, but it's not correct to say that the Supreme Court has never supported President imposing tariffs without going back to Congress.
I want to talk about how exactly you think the Supreme Court's going to rule, because you're thinking that they could strike down a certain provision but then uphold others. So how many tariffs does that impact?
Well, if you count the 92 countries, I think it was a total of 92 on which he imposed the tariffs. And if you assume that it's 40 or 50 items or maybe more for some of those, you're talking about literally thousands of tariffs.
And so, what are the economic impacts here? Let's talk some hypotheticals. Let's say that Supreme Court upholds President Trump's tariffs. They remain in place. Is the economy status quo? What does that do to the economy?
Well, the tariffs, for the most part, are being collected as we speak. So it would not be any change in the economic impact from what we're already seeing. Where the change would come would be if they overrule a tariff, or if they overruled all of the tariffs, then we would have to refund money. That would increase the federal debt, because that tariff money has been applied in debt reduction. So it would have that impact on the economy. But the other impact that it would have is, what will Trump do next? Presumably, he still has underway several separate investigations under 232. He has semiconductors and pharmaceuticals are two of them. Also, in theory, he could go back to the Senate and ask them to approve the tariffs, because it's clear that with senatorial approval, he does have the ability, congressional approval, he does have the ability to impose tariffs. So at least in theory, that could be a fallback position. Now, whether he would be able to get the votes in the Congress is a different question, but that certainly is one fallback. The other fallback would be to reinstitute the investigations we did last time under 232 or under 301 and follow that pattern. Now, that if he did that, that would, I think, have a very high probability of prevailing, but it would take months. So there'd be months during which a lot of tariffs would be in limbo. And then the final question is, let's say the court knocks it out. What will the other countries do with the reprisals that they were making? Will they leave those in place? Will they cancel those? So there are an awful lot of questions. But I think one of the factors the Supreme Court would likely consider is it really worth creating this amount of global confusion over a very highly technical issue?
I think that's a good question, because as you were saying that, I was in my head trying to do the gymnastics around that, right? Because let's say the Trump or the Supreme Court blocks the tariffs, right? Then the administration tries to find other avenues to get them back implemented. Then that takes months and months. So is the government then refunding the tariff money to, let's say the tariffs come back now, they get that money back? I mean, what does this entire refund process look like? How messy is that?
Well, it would be very, very messy and make a lot of confusion in just about every country in the world. So it would be a genuine international mess. And because so many countries are involved, it might get even more complicated, in that some countries might change their initial response, some might leave it the same, some might modify it some. I mean, you don't know what the other countries will do.
And from your perspective as a former Commerce Secretary, what does this do to trade negotiations right now? Does it give these other countries leverage and perhaps bargaining power if the Supreme Court strikes down partially these tariffs or all of these tariffs to come to the table with the United States and say, hey, you don't have the chips anymore, we do?
Well, I don't think it would change their ultimate negotiating position. If the tariffs are knocked out, then those tariffs do not exist. So there's nothing to negotiate about them. And as a result, it would be beginning negotiations all over again, presumably under some other provision of the federal codes or going back to Congress. But if I were a foreign country, I don't know, frankly, quite what I would do, because either way, it's a very complicated situation. And so I think you will probably find, if the Supreme Court goes no on everything, I think you'll find there'll be a variety of foreign responses. There's nothing that requires EU to respond the same way as Japan or South Korea or anybody else.
I've seen the argument that since the tariffs are central to President Trump's economic policy, that if a swath of them were struck down by the Supreme Court, the stock market would plunge because they are already baked in. Do you agree? If the tariffs are struck down, is that detrimental to our economy? Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent thinks so as well.
Well, I think it would be detrimental in this regard. Anytime you introduce confusion, anytime you introduce uncertainty, it tends to paralyze business decisions. So, for example, all these capital expenditures that foreign and domestic companies have said they will make because of the tariffs, presumably a lot of those will now be put on hold. Well, that's another sort of confusion. What do you do with a 1/3 built plant? What do you do with a 20% built plant? With a plant that's still under planning, do you keep planning or do you just scuttle it? I mean, the amount of confusion that would be created is pretty stupendous. And I noticed that was one of the arguments that the administration used in their Supreme Court papers.
How strong is that argument that this would just cause so much confusion, it's not worth it? How much weight does that have for the Supreme Court? I know you said it carries some weight, but will the justices really take that into consideration?
Well, that's a good question. He has other arguments as well, namely his fundamental argument. His fundamental argument is, who's to tell the president that he doesn't know how to declare an emergency? Because there are two issues that are here. One is he able to do it under any circumstance? And then the other issue is this a circumstance under which he's able to do it? I would be very surprised if the Supreme Court would say, we can second guess the president as to what's a national emergency. That's a pretty big reach for judges to take.
I know that you were Commerce Secretary in President Trump's first term. Let's say you were the Commerce Secretary now. I mean, the theme of this conversation is just how confusing the moment we are in right now when it comes to tariffs. I mean, what would be your moves right now if you were the Commerce Secretary?
I think I would say a prayer every day that the Supreme Court upholds them.
And would you want the Supreme Court to uphold them just cleanly? They're all in place, status quo with President Trump's tariffs.
Well, that would be the simplest solution. But even if they knock out a few, it's not so bad, because it would be very limited confusion and it would put to bed pretty permanently all the rest of it. So that would do much more good than harm. So either way, if it's a very limited vetoing, I don't think that would be very bad. The only really bad thing would be if it totally dismantles the whole thing. Now, you can argue that's not a legal argument, that's a practical argument. But I would be surprised if the Supreme Court, at least privately, wouldn't consider the practical implications as well.
And tariffs are central to President Trump's trade policy. Let's say the Supreme Court goes the dismantling route and strikes them all down. What does that do to his trade and economic agenda? Does it completely unravel it?
Well, the other components would still be in place. The regulatory reform, the encouragement of oil and gas, the other thing that would be in place would be the old tariffs that we had put in last time, because they have been upheld. So there would be quite a little bit of it left. And most importantly, what would be left would be his tax policy, because the big, beautiful tax bill did pass, was enacted into law. So that provision, which is, in my view, a very important part of his economic agenda, that provision would stay. So it isn't so much that it would cripple his economic agenda near term, because he would also, I'm 100% sure, try to find some solution to put the tariffs back in. So it would create more of a temporary confusion than it would anything else. But that could be very serious. And by temporary, it could very well take 6 months, 12 months, some long period like that to straighten out.
I've read an argument that floats the idea that President Trump almost wants the Supreme Court to strike down the tariffs, because this critic says that it could be a win-win for President Trump. One, the win is that the tariffs are struck down and any economic blowback from the tariffs is gone. And two, President Trump could say, hey, my hands were tied. I tried with the tariffs. It didn't work because the justices struck down and ruled against me. Do you think that that argument holds any weight?
Oh, I will bet you dollars to donuts that if they turn it down, he will try to find a way to put them back in. I don't have any doubt about that.
And then if I'm a business owner, what am I thinking right now? Am I waiting on pins and needles to see where the Supreme Court ends up ruling? How do I prepare?
Well, they're going to rule very quickly. I think they said that they would hear it in November, which is very, very quick time, because it has to be brief. There's a whole process for it to go through. So they clearly have shown that they're aware of the problem of leaving this in limbo for any extended period. And I think that's a good sign and a very responsible sign from the court.
And as we know, this court is conservative leaning. When you're listening to the oral arguments, what are you listening out for to see which way their headspace is, which way they're leaning? Are you looking out for anything in particular?
Well, it's tea leaf reading, but what you focus on is what's the nature of the questions, particularly follow-up questions that the individual justices put forward. You know that some of the justices will be very negative. So in a sense, it almost doesn't matter what they say. What matters is the majority that often goes with Trump. The question will be how many of those hold in place, because it isn't like 10 to 1. This is a very closely split Supreme Court.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for. And as we hear those oral arguments in the Supreme Court, and as we see a decision, I hope you can come back on and break it down with me. Former Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, thank you again for joining me. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you for having me on. I look forward to it.